been burned, the corruption of those who had not. Even the ones already burned mingled with the dry soil of their graves. That helped. For a while after Saidin was gone, all he did was take deep breaths of hot, arid air. Compared to before, the whiff of death seemed absent, and the air itself pure and wonderful. "Look what was here before us," Avienda said, as he let a meek-faced, white-robed woman take Jiaden. She held up a brown snake, dead, but as thick as his forearm, and nearly 3 paces long. The blood snake took its name from the effect of its bite, turning the blood to jelly in minutes. Unless he missed his guess, the neat wound behind its head had come from her belt knife. Adeline and the other maidens looked approving. "Did you ever for 1 minute think that it could have bitten you?" he said. "Did you ever think of using the power instead of a bloody belt knife? Why didn't you kiss it first? You had to be close enough." She drew herself up, and her big green eyes should have brought on the night's chill early. "The wise ones say it is not good to use the power too often." The clipped words were as cold as her eyes. "They say it is possible to draw too much and harm yourself." Frowning slightly, she added, more to herself than him, "Though I have not come near what I can hold yet, I am sure of it." Shaking his head, he ducked into the tent. The woman would not listen to reason. No sooner had he settled himself against a silk cushion near the still unlit fire than she followed him. Without the blood snake, thankfully, but gingerly carrying something long, wrapped in thick layers of gray-striped blanket. "You were worried for me," she said in a flat voice. There was no expression at all on her face. "Of course not," he lied. "Fool woman. She'll get herself killed yet because she doesn't have the sense to be careful when it's needed." "I'd have been as worried for anyone. I would not want anyone bitten by a blood snake." For a moment, she eyed him doubtfully, then gave a quick nod. "Good. So long as you do not presume toward me." Tossing the bundled blanket at his feet, she sat on her heels across the fire pit from him. "You would not accept the buckle as canceling debt between us? Avienda, there is no debt." He thought that she had forgotten about that. She went on as if he had not spoken. "But perhaps that will cancel it." Sighing, he unwrapped the striped blanket. Warily, since she had held it far more uneasily than she had the snake. She had held the bloody snake as if it were a piece of cloth. Unwrapped it, and gasped. What lay inside was a sword, the scabbard so encrusted with rubies and moondrops that it was hard to see the gold except where a rising sun of many rays had been inset. The ivory hilt, long enough for 2 hands, had another inlaid rising sun in gold. The pommel was thick with rubies and moondrops, and still more made a solid mass along the quillons. This had never been made to use, only to be seen, to be stared at. "This must have cost. Avienda, how could you pay for it?" "It cost little," she said, so defensively that she might as well have added that she lied. "A sword? How did you ever come by a sword? How did any Aiel come by a sword? Don't tell me Kadir had this hidden in his wagons." "I carried it in a blanket." She sounded even more touchy now than she had about the price. "Even Bear said that would make it all right, so long as I did not actually touch it." She shrugged uncomfortably, shifting and reshifting her shawl. "It was the tree killer's sword, Layman's. It was taken from his body as proof that he was dead, because his head could not be brought back so far. Since then it has passed from hand to hand, young men or fool maidens who wanted to own the proof of his death. Only each began to think of what it was, and soon sold it to another fool. The price has come down very far since it was first sold. No Aiel would lay hand to it, even to remove the stones." "Well, it is very beautiful," he said, as tactfully as he could manage. Only a buffoon would carry something this gaudy, and that ivory hilt would twist in a hand slippery with sweat or blood. "But I cannot let you." He trailed off as he bared a few inches of the blade, out of habit, to examine the edge. Etched into the shining steel stood a heron, symbol of a blade master. He had carried a sword marked like that once. Suddenly he was ready to bet that this blade was like it, like the raven-marked blade on Matt's spear. Metal made with power that would never break and never need sharpening. Most blade masters' swords were only copies of those. Lan could tell him for certain, but he was sure already in his own mind. Pulling the scabbard off, he leaned across the fire pit to place it in front of her. I will take the blade to cancel the debt, Avienda. It was long and slightly curved with a single edge. Just the blade. You can have the hilt back, too. He could have a new hilt and scabbard made in Kyrian. Maybe one of Tayan's survivors was a decent bladesmith. She stared wide-eyed from the scabbard to him and back, mouth open, stunned for the first time that he had ever seen. But those gems are worth much, much more than I... You are trying to put me in your debt again, Randall Thor. Not so. If this blade had lain untouched and untarnished in its scabbard for over 20 years, it had to be what he thought. I did not accept the scabbard, so it has been yours all along. Tossing one of the silk cushions into the air, he executed the seated version of the form called Low Wind Rising. Feathers rained down as the blade sliced neatly through. And I don't accept the hilt either, so that's yours too. If you have made a profit, it is your own doing. Instead of looking happy at her good fortune, he suspected she had given everything that she had for the sword, and likely gotten back 100 times as much or more in the scabbard alone. Instead of seeming glad or thanking him, she glared through the feathers as indignantly as any good wife in the Two Rivers, seeing her floor littered. Stiffly, she clapped, and one of the Gaishain appeared, immediately going to her knees to begin cleaning up the mess. It is my tent, he said pointedly. Avienda sniffed at him in perfect imitation of Egwene. Those two women were definitely spending too much time together. Supper, when it came at full dark, consisted of the usual flat pale bread and a spicy stew of dried peppers and beans with chunks of nearly white meat. He only grinned at her when he learned that it was the blood snake. He had eaten snake, and worse, since coming to the waste. Gara, the poisonous lizard, was the worst in his estimation, not for the taste, which was rather like chicken, but because it was lizard. It sometimes seemed that there must be more poisonous things, snakes, lizards, spiders, plants, in the waste than in the rest of the world combined. Avienda appeared disappointed that he did not spit the stew out in disgust, though sometimes it was difficult to tell what she was feeling. At times, she seemed to take great pleasure in discomfiting him. Had he been trying to pretend that he was Aiel, he would have thought she was trying to prove he was not. Tired and eager for sleep, he only took off his coat and boots before crawling into his blankets and turning his back to Avienda. Aiel men and women might take sweat baths together, but a short time in Shinar, where they did something much the same, had convinced him that he was not made for that sort of thing, not without going so red in the face that he died of it. He had tried not to listen to the rustle of her undressing beneath her own blankets. At least she had that much modesty. But he kept his back turned anyway, just in case. She claimed she was supposed to sleep there to continue his lessons on Aiel ways and customs, since he spent so much of his days with the chiefs. They both knew that was a lie, though what the wise ones thought she could find out this way, he could not imagine. She gave little grunts every now and then as she tugged at something and muttered to herself. To cover the sounds and stop himself thinking of what they must mean, he said, Mullane's wedding was impressive. Did Bale really know nothing about it until Mullane and Dorinda told him? Of course not, she replied scornfully, pausing for what he thought was a stocking coming off. Why should he know before Mullane laid the bridal wreath at his feet and asked him? Abruptly she laughed. Mullane nearly drove herself and Dorinda to distraction finding cicada blossoms for the wreath. Few grow so close to the dragon wall. Does that mean something special? The cigada blossoms? That was what he had sent her, the flowers she had never acknowledged. That she has a prickly nature and means to keep it. Another pause, broken by mutters. Had she used leaves or flowers from sweet root, it would have meant she claimed a sweet nature. Morning drop would mean she would be submissive, and there are too many to list. It would take me days to teach all the combinations to you, and you do not need to know them. You will not have an Aiel wife. You belong to Elaine. He nearly looked at her when she said submissive, a word less likely to describe any Aiel woman he could not conceive. Probably means she gives warning before she stabs you. There had been more of a muffled sound to her voice at the end. Pulling her blouse over her head, he realized. He wished the lamps were out. No, that would have made it worse. But then he had been through this every single night since Rodion, and every single night it was worse. He had to put an end to it. The woman was going to sleep with the wise ones, where she belonged from now on. He would learn what he could from her as he could. He had thought exactly the same thing for 15 nights now. Trying to chase the pictures out of his head, he said, "That bit at the end, after the vows were said." No sooner had half a dozen wise ones pronounced their blessings than 100 of Melane's bloodkin had rushed in to surround her, all carrying their spears. 100 of Bale's kin had rallied to him, and he had fought his way to her. No one had been veiled, of course. It was all part of custom. But blood had still been shed on both sides. A few minutes before, Melaine was vowing that she loved him, but when he reached her, she fought like a cornered ridge cat. If Dorinda had not punched her in the short ribs, he did not think Bale would ever have gotten her over his shoulder to carry off. He still has the limp and the black eye she gave him. Should she have been a weakling? Avienda said sleepily. He had to know the worth of her. She was not a trinket for him to put in his pouch. She yawned, and he heard her nestling deeper into her blankets. What does teaching a man to sing mean? Aiel men did not sing, not once they were old enough to take up a spear, except for battle chants and laments for the dead. You are thinking of Matt Cawthon. She actually giggled. Sometimes a man gives up the spear for a maiden. You're making that up. I never heard of anything like that. Well, it is not really giving up the spear. Her voice held a thick muzziness. Sometimes a man desires a maiden who will not give up the spear for him, and he arranges to be taken gai'shain by her. He is a fool, of course. No maiden would look at gai'shain as he hopes. He has worked hard and kept strictly to his place, and the first thing that is done is to make him learn to sing, to entertain the Spear Sisters while they eat. She is going to teach him to sing. That is what maidens say when a man makes a fool of himself over one of the Spear Sisters. A very peculiar people. Avienda, he had said he was not going to ask her this again. Lance said it was Kandori work, a pattern called snowflakes, probably loot from some raid up north. Who gave you that necklace? A friend, Randall Thor. We came far today, and you will start us early tomorrow. Sleep well and wake, Randall Thor. Only an Aiel would wish you a good night by hoping that you did not die in your sleep. Setting the much smaller, if much more intricate ward on his dreams, he channeled the lamps out and tried to sleep. A friend. The rain came from the north, but she had had the necklace in Rodion. Why did he care? Avienda's slow breathing seemed loud in his ears until he fell asleep, and then he dreamed a confused dream of Min and Elaine helping him throw Avienda, wearing nothing but that necklace, over his shoulder, while she beat him over the head with a wreath of cigada blossoms. Chapter 22. Bird Calls by Night. Lying face down on his blankets with his eyes closed, Matt luxuriated in the feel of Melindra's thumbs, kneading their way down his spine. There was nothing quite as good as a massage after a long day in the saddle. Well, some things were, but Right then, he was willing to settle for her thumbs. You are well muscled for such a short man, Matrim Cawthon. He opened one eye and glanced back at her, kneeling astride his hips. She had built up the fire twice as high as needed, and sweat trickled down her body. Her fine golden hair, close cut except for that Aiel tail at the nape of her neck, clung to her scalp. If I'm too short, you can always find somebody else. You are not too short for my taste, she laughed, ruffling his hair. It was longer than hers. And you are cute. Relax. This does no good if you tense. Grunting, he closed his eyes again. Cute, light, and short. Only Aiel could call him short. In every other land he had been in, he was taller than most men, if not always by much. He could remember being tall, taller than Rand when he rode against Arthur Hawkwing, and a hand shorter than he was now when he fought beside Maycene against the Elgari. He had spoken to Lan, claiming he had overheard some names. The warder said Maycene had been a king of Earron, one of the 10 nations. That much Matt already knew, some 400 or 500 years before the Trolloc Wars. Lan doubted that even the Brown Arja knew more. Much had been lost in the Trolloc Wars, and more in the War of the 100 Years. Those were the earliest and latest of the memories that had been planted in his skull. Nothing after Arthur Peyendrag Tanrial, and nothing before Maycene of Earron. Are you cold? Melindra said incredulously. You shivered. She scrambled off him, and he heard her add wood to the fire. There was enough scrub here for burning. She slapped his bottom hard as she climbed back on, murmuring, Good muscle. If you keep on like that, he muttered, I'll think you mean to spit me for supper, like a Trolloc. It was not that he did not enjoy Melindra, as long as she refrained from pointing out that she was taller anyway, but the situation made him uncomfortable. No spits for you, Matrim Cawthon. Her thumbs dug hard into his shoulder. That's it. Relax. He supposed that he would marry someday, settle down. That's what you did. A woman, a house, a family, shackled to one spot for the rest of his life. I never heard of a wife yet that liked her husband having a drink or a gamble. And there was what those folk on the other side of the doorframe Tirangriel had said, that he was fated to marry the daughter of the 9 years. Sooner or later, I suppose. But he certainly did not mean to take an Aiel wife. He wanted to dance with as many women as he could, while he could. You are not made for spits, but for great honor, I think, Melindra said softly. Sounds good to me. Only now he could not get another woman to look at him. Not the maidens or the others. It was as if Melindra had hung a sign on him saying, Owned by Melindra of the Jumai Shido. Well, she would not have to put that last bit on. Not here. Then again, who knew what an Aiel would do, especially a maiden of the spear? Women did not think the same as men, and Aiel women did not think like anybody else in the world. It is strange that you efface yourself so. Efface myself? He mumbled. Her hands did feel good. Knots were coming out that he had not known. Oh, he wondered if it had something to do with that necklace. Melindra seemed to set great store by it, or by receiving it anyway. She never wore the thing, of course. Maidens did not. But she carried it in her pouch and showed it to every woman who asked. A lot of them seemed to. You put yourself in the shadow of Randall Thor. I am not in anyone's shadow, he said absently. It could not be the necklace. He could have given jewelry to other women. Maybe to others. He liked giving things to women, even if all he got in return was a smile. He never expected more. If a woman did not enjoy a kiss and a cuddle as much as he did, what was the point? Of course, there is honor of a sort in being in the shadow of the Khan. To be near the mighty, you must stand in their shade. Shade, Matt agreed, not really hearing. Sometimes the women accepted, and sometimes not, but none had decided they owned him. That was what rankled, really. He was not about to be owned by any woman, however pretty she was, and no matter how good her hands were at loosening knotted muscles. Your scars should be scars of honor, earned in your own name as a chief, not this. One finger traced along the hanging scar on his neck. Did you earn this serving the Kara Khan? Shrugging her hand away, he pushed up on his elbows and twisted to look at her. Are you sure Daughter of the Nine Moons doesn't mean anything to you? I have told you it does not. Lie down. If you are lying to me, I swear I'll welt your rump. Hands on hips, she looked down at him dangerously. Do you think you can welt my rump, Matt Coughlin? I'll give it my best try. She would probably put a spear through his ribs. Do you swear you've never heard of the Daughter of the Nine Moons? I never have, she said slowly. Who is she? Or what? Lie down and let me... A blackbird called, seemingly everywhere in the tent and outside as well. And a moment later, a redwing. Good Two Rivers birds. Rand had chosen his warnings from what he knew. Birds not found in the waste. Melindra was off him in an instant, wrapping her shufa around her head, veiling herself as she snatched up spears and bucklers. She darted from the tent like that. Blood and bloody ashes, Matt muttered as he struggled into his breeches. A redwing meant the south. He and Melindra had put up their tent to the south, with the Charine, as far from Rand as they could get and stay in the encampment. He was not going outside in those thorn bushes naked, the way Melindra had. The blackbird meant north, where the Sharad were camped. They were coming from two sides at once. Stamping his feet in his boots, as best he could in the low tent, he looked at the silver fox head lying beside his blankets. Shouts were rising outside, the clash of metal on metal. He had finally figured out that medallion had somehow kept Moraine from healing him on her first try. So long as he had been touching it, her channeling had not affected him. He had never heard of Shadow Spawn able to channel, but there was always the Black Aja. So Rand said, and he believed it. And always the chance that one of the Forsaken had finally come after him. Pulling the leather thong over his head and hung on his chest, he snatched up his blazing spear and ducked out into the cold moonlight. He had no time to feel the icy chill. Before he was completely out of the tent, he almost lost his head to a scythe-curved Trolloc sword. The blade brushed his hair as he threw himself into a low dive, rolling to his feet with the spear ready. At first glance in the darkness, the Trolloc might have been a bulky man, though half again as tall as any Aiel, garbed all in black mail with spikes at elbows and shoulders, and a helmet with goat's horns attached. But these horns grew out of that too-human head, and below the eyes, a goat's muzzle thrust out. Snarling, the Trolloc lunged to him and howled in a harsh language never meant for a human tongue. Matt spun his spear like a quarterstaff, knocking the heavy curved blade to one side, and thrust his long spear point into the creature's middle, mail parting for that power-made steel as easily as the flesh beneath. The goat-snotted Trolloc folded over with a harsh cry, and Matt pulled his weapon free, dodging aside as it fell. All around him, Aiel, some unclothed, or only half, but all black fought Trollocs with tusked boars' snouts, or wolves' muzzles, or eagles' beaks, some with heads horned, or crested with feathers, wielding those curved swords and spiked axes, hooked tridents and spears. Here and there, one used a huge bow to shoot barbed arrows the size of small spears. Men fought alongside the Trollocs too, in rough coats, with swords, shouting desperately as they died among the thorn bushes. Samael! Samael and the Golden Bees! The Dark Friends were dying, most as soon as they engaged in Aiel, but the Trollocs died harder. I am no bloody hero, Matt shouted to no one in particular as he battled the Trolloc with a bear's muzzle and hairy ears, his third. The creature carried a long-handled axe with half a dozen sharp spikes and a flaring blade big enough to split a tree, throwing it about like a toy in those great hairy hands. It was being near Rand that got Matt into these things. All he wanted from life was some good wine, a game of dice, and a pretty girl or three. "I don't want to be mixed up in this," especially not if Samael was around. "Do you hear me?" The Trolloc went down with a ruined throat, and he found himself facing a Murdral, just as it finished killing two Aiel who had come at it together. The half-man looked like a man, pasty pale, armored in black overlapping scales like a snake's. It moved like a snake, too, boneless and fluid and quick, night-black cloak hanging still, however it darted. And it had no eyes, just a dead-white sweep of skin where eyes should be. That eyeless gaze turned on him, and he shivered, fear oozing along his bones. The look of the eyeless is fear, they said in the Borderlands, where they should know. And even Aiel admitted that a Murderal's stare sent chills through the marrow. That was the creature's first weapon. The half-men came at him in a flowing run. With a roar, Matt rushed to meet it, spear spinning like a quarterstaff, thrusting, ever moving. The thing carried a blade as dark as its cloak, a sword hammered at the forges of Thakandar, and if that cut him, he was as good as dead unless Moiraine appeared quickly with her healing. But there was only one sure way to take down a Fade. All-out attack. You had to overwhelm it before it overwhelmed you. And a thought for defense could be a good way to die. He could not even spare a glance for the battle raging around him in the night. The Murdral's blade flickered like a serpent's tongue, darted like black lightning, but to counter Matt's attack. When Raven-marked power-wrought steel met Thakandar-made metal, blue light flashed around them, a crackle of sheet. Suddenly, Matt's slashing attack struck flesh. Black sword and pale hand flew away, and the reverse stroke sliced open the Murdral's throat, but Matt did not stop. Thrust through the heart, cut to one hamstring, then the other, all in rapid succession. Only then did he step away from the thing still thrashing on the ground, flailing about with its good hand and severed stump, wounds spilling inky blood. Half-men took a long time to admit that they were dead. They did not die completely, except with a setting sun. Looking around, Matt realized that the attack was over. Whatever dark friends or Trollocs were not dead had fled. At least he saw none standing except Aiel. Some of them were down too. He plucked a kerchief from the neck of a dark friend corpse to wipe the Murdral's black blood from his spear point. It would etch the metal if left too long. This night assault made no sense. By the bodies he could see in the moonlight, Trolloc and human, none had made it much past the first line of tents. And without far greater numbers, they could not have hoped for more. What was that you called out? The old tongue? He turned to look at Melindra. She had unveiled, but she still wore not a stitch more than her shufa. There were other maidens about, and men, wearing as little and showing as little concern, though most did seem to be heading back to their tents without lingering. They had no modesty. That was it. No modesty at all. She did not even seem to feel the cold, though her breath made wisps of mist. He was as sweaty as she, and freezing now that he had no fight for his life to occupy his mind. Something I heard once, he told her. I like the sound of it. Karai an Kaldazar, for the honor of the Red Eagle, the battle cry of Manetheren. Most of his memories were from Manetheren, some of those he had before the twisted doorway. Moiraine said it was the old blood coming out, just as long as it did not come out of his veins. She put an arm around his shoulders as he started back toward their tent. I saw you with the Night Runner, Matt Cawthon. That was one of the Aiel names for Myrddraal. You are as tall as a man needs to be. Grinning, he slipped his arm around her waist, but he could not get the attack out of his head. He wanted to, His thoughts were too snarled in his borrowed memories. But he could not. Why had anyone launched such a hopeless assault? No one but a fool attacked overwhelming force without a reason. That was the thought he could not pry out of his head. No one attacked without a reason. The bird calls pulled Rand awake immediately, and he seized Sayadine as he tossed the blankets aside and ran out, coatless in his stocking feet. The night was cold and moonlit, faint sounds of battle drifting up from the hills below the pass. Around him, Aiel stirred like scurrying ants, rushing into the night to where an attack might come here in the pass. The wards would signal again. Shadowspawn in the pass would cause a winterfinch to call, until he unraveled them in the morning. But there was no point in taking foolish chances. Soon the pass was still again. The Gaishain in their tents, forbidden entrance even now. The other Aiel off at the places that might need defending. Even Adeline and the other maidens had gone, as if they knew he would have held them back if they waited. He could hear a few mutters from the wagons near the town walls, but neither the drivers nor Kadir showed themselves. He did not expect them to. The faint sounds of battle, men shouting, screaming, dying, came from two directions. Both below, well away from him. People were out around the Wise One's tents too, staring toward the fighting, it seemed. An attack down there made no sense. It was not the Miagoma, not unless Timolan had taken Shadowspawn into his clan, and that was as likely as White Cloaks recruiting Trollocs. He turned back toward his tent, and even enclosed in the void, he gave a start. Avienda had come out into the moonlight, a blanket wrapped around her. Just beyond her stood a tall man shrouded in a dark cloak. Moon shadows drifted over a gaunt face that was too pale, with eyes too large. A crooning rose, and the cloak opened into wide, leathery wings like those of a bat. Moving as in a dream, Avienda drifted toward the waiting embrace. Rand channeled, and finger-thin balefire burned past her, an arrow of solid light to take the Drakkar in the head. The effect of that narrower stream was slower, but no less sure than with the Darkhounds. The creature's colors reversed, black to white, white to black, and it became sparkling motes that melted in air. Avienda shook herself as the crooning ended, stared at the last particles as they vanished, and turned to Rand, gathering the blanket closer. Her hand came up, and a stream of fire as thick as his head roared toward him. Startled even inside the emptiness, never thinking of the power, he threw himself to the ground beneath the billowing flames. They died in an instant. "What are you doing?" he barked, so angry, so shocked, that the void cracked and Sayadine vanished from him. He scrambled to his feet, stalking toward her. "This tops any ingratitude I ever heard of." He was going to shake her until her teeth rattled. "I just saved your life, in case you failed to notice. And if I offended some bloody Aiel custom, I don't give a—" "The next time," she snapped back, "I will leave the great Ka-Karn to deal with matters by himself." Awkwardly clutching the blanket close, she ducked stiff-backed into the tent. For the first time, he looked behind him, at another Drakkar, crumpled on the ground in flames. He had been so angry that he had not heard the crackling and popping as it burned, had not smelled the odor of burning grease. He had not even sensed the evil of it. A Drakkar killed first by sucking the soul away, and then life. It had to be close, touching, but this one lay no more than 2 paces from where he had been standing. He was not certain how effective a Drakkar's crooning embrace was against someone filled with Sayadine, but he was glad he had not found out. Drawing a deep breath, he knelt beside the tent flap. "Avienda?" He could not go in. A lamp was lit in there, and she could be sitting there naked for all he knew, mentally ripping him up and down the way he deserved. "Avienda, I'm sorry. I apologize. I was a fool to speak as I did without asking why. I should know that you wouldn't harm me, and I'm a fool," he finished weakly. "A great deal, Randall Thor," came a muffled reply. "You are a fool." How did Aiel apologize? He had never asked her that. Considering Giotto, teaching men to sing, and wedding customs, he did not think he would. Yes, I am. And I apologize. There was no answer this time. Your blankets? Silence. Muttering to himself, he stood, working his stocking toes on the icy ground. He was going to have to remain out here until he was sure she was decently covered, without boots or coat. He seized hold of Saidine, taint and all, just to be distanced from the bone-grinding cold inside the void. The three Wise One Dreamwalkers came running, of course, and Egwene, all staring at the burning Drakkar as they skirted it, drawing their shawls around them with almost the same motion. Only one, Amis said. I thank the light, but I am surprised. There were two, Rand told her. I destroyed the other. Why should he be hesitant just because Moiraine had warned him against balefire? It was a weapon like any other. If Aviendha had not killed this one, it might have gotten me. The feel of her channeling drew us, looking him up and down. At first he thought she was checking for injuries, but she paid special attention to his stocking feet, then glanced at the tent, where a crack in the tent flap showed lamplight. You've upset her again, haven't you? She saved your life, and you... Men! With a disgusted shake of her head, she brushed past him and into the tent. He heard faint voices, but could not make out what was being said. Melaine gave a hitch to her shawl. If you do not need us, then we must see what is happening below. She hurried off without waiting for the other two. Bear cackled as she and Amis followed. A wager on who she will check on first. My amethyst necklace that you like so much against that sapphire bracelet of yours? Done. I choose Dorinda. The older Wise One cackled again. Her eyes are still full of bale. A first sister is a first sister, but a new husband... They moved down out of earshot, and he bent toward the tent flap. He could still not hear what they were saying, not unless he stuck his ear to the crack, and he was not about to do that. Surely Aviendha had covered herself with Egwene in there. Then again, the way Egwene had taken to Aiel ways, it was just as likely she had peeled out of her clothes instead. The soft sound of slippers announced Moiraine and Lan, and Rand straightened. Though he could hear both of them breathing, the warder's steps still made barely an audible noise. Moraine's hair hung about her face, and she held a dark robe around her, the silk shining with the moon. Lan was fully dressed, booted and armed, wrapped in that cloak that made him part of the night. Of course, the clamor of fighting was dying down in the hills below. I'm surprised you were not here sooner, Moiraine. His voice sounded cold, but better his voice than him. He held on to Saidine, fought it, and the night's icy chill remained something far off. He was aware of it, aware of each hair on his arms stirring with cold beneath his shirt sleeves, but it did not touch him. You usually come looking for me as soon as you sense trouble. I have never explained all that I do, or do not do. Her voice was as coolly mysterious as it had ever been, yet even in the moonlight, Rand was certain that she was blushing. Lan looked troubled, though with him it was difficult to tell. I cannot hold your hand forever. Eventually, you must walk alone. I did that tonight, didn't I? Embarrassment slid across the void. That sounded as though he had done everything himself, and he added, Aviendha all but took one off my back. The flames in the Drakkar were burning low. As well she was here, then, Moiraine said calmly. You did not need me. She had not been afraid, of that he was sure. He had seen her rush into the midst of Shadowspawn, wielding the power as skillfully as Lan did his sword. Seen it too often to believe fear in her. So why had she not come when she sensed the Drakkar? She could have, and Lan as well. That was one of the gifts a warder received from the bond between him and an Aes Sedai. He could make her tell, catch her between her oath to him and her inability to lie straight out. No, He could not. Or would not. He would not do that to someone who was trying to help him. At least now we know what the attack below was about, he said. To make me think something important was happening there, while the Drakkar slipped in on me. They tried that at Cold Rock's Hold, and it did not work there either. Only maybe it almost had, this time. If that had been the intent. You would think they would try something different. Couladin ahead of him, the Forsaken everywhere, it seemed. Why could he not face one enemy at a time? Do not make the mistake of thinking the Forsaken simple, Moraine said. That could easily be fatal. She shifted her robe as though wishing it were thicker. The hour is late. If you have no further need of me... Aiel began to drift back as she and the warder left. Some exclaimed over the Drakkar, and roused some of the guys Shine to drag it away, but most simply looked at it before going to their tents. They seemed to expect such things of him now. When Adolin and the maidens appeared, their soft-booted feet dragged. They stared at the Drakkar, being hauled away by white-robed men, and exchanged long looks before approaching Rand. There was nothing here, Adolin said slowly. The attack was all below. Dark friends and Trollocs. Shouting Samael and the Golden Bees, I heard, added another. With her head wrapped in a shufa, Rand could not make out who she was. She sounded young. Some of the maidens were not more than 16. Taking a deep breath, Adolin held out one of her spears, horizontally in front of him, rock steady. The others did the same, one spear each. I failed, Adolin said. We should have been here when the Drakkar came. Instead, we ran like children to dance the spears. What am I supposed to do with those? Rand asked, and Adolin replied without hesitation. Whatever you wish, Ka'akarn. We stand ready and will not resist. Rand shook his head. Bloody Aiel and their bloody Giotto. You take those and go back to guarding my tent. Well, go! Looks passed between them before they began to obey, as reluctantly as they had approached him in the first place. And one of you tell Avienda that I will be coming in when I return, he added. He was not going to spend the entire night outside, wondering whether it was safe. He stalked away, the stony ground hard under his feet. Osmodian's tent was not very far from his. There had not been a sound out of it. He whipped open the flap and ducked in. Osmodian was sitting in the dark, chewing his lip. He flinched when Rand appeared, and gave him no chance to speak. You did not expect him to take a hand, did you? I felt the Drakkar, but you could deal with those. You did. I have never liked Drakkar. We should never have made them. They have fewer brains than a Trolloc. Give them an order, and they still sometimes kill whatever is closest. If I had come out, if I had done something, what if someone noticed? What if they realized it could not be you channeling? Well for you that you didn't, Rand cut him off, sitting cross-legged in the dark. If I had felt you full of sardine out there tonight, I might have killed you. The other man's laugh was shaky. I thought of that, too. It was Samael who sent the attack tonight. The Trollocs and Dark Friends, anyway. It is not like Samael to throw men away, Osmodian said slowly. But he'll see 10,000 dead, or 10 times that, if it gains him what he thinks is worth the cost. And the others want you to think it was him. Even if the Aiel took prisoners, Trollocs do not think of much besides killing, and Dark Friends believe what they are told. It was him. He tried to bait me into attacking him once in the same way at Sarendahar. Oh, light. The thought drifted across the surface of the void. I said me. He did not know where Sarendahar had been, or anything but what he had said. The words had just come out. After a long silence, Osmodian said quietly, I never knew that. What I want to know is, why? Rand chose his words carefully, hoping that they were all his. He remembered Samael's face. A man. Not mine. Not my memory. A compact man with a short yellow beard. Asmodean had described all the Forsaken, but he knew this image was not made from that description. Samael had always wanted to be taller, and resented it that the power could not make him so. Asmodean had never told him that. From what you've told me, he is not likely to want to face me unless he is sure of victory. And maybe not then. You said he'd likely leave me to the Dark One if he could. So why is he sure he'll win now if I decide to go after him? They discussed it in the dark for hours without coming to any conclusion. Asmodean held to the opinion that it had been one of the others, hoping to send Rand against Samael, and thus get rid of one or both. At least Asmodean said that he did. Rand could feel the man's dark eyes on him, wondering. That slip had been too big to cover. When he finally returned to his own tent, Adeline and the dozen maidens all sprang to their feet, all of them at once telling him that Egwene was gone and Aviendha long asleep. That she was angry with him, they both were. They gave so many different pieces of advice on handling the two women's anger, all at the same time, that he could understand none of it. Finally, they fell silent, looks passing between them, and Adeline spoke alone. We must speak of tonight, of what we did, and what we failed to do. It was nothing, he told her. And if it was something, it's forgiven and forgotten. I would like to have a few hours' sleep for once. If you want to discuss it, go talk to Amis or Bear. I am sure they'll understand what you're after more than I do. That shut them up, surprisingly, and let him get inside. Aviendha was in her blankets, with one slim, bare leg sticking out. He tried not to look at it, or her. She had left a lamp lit. He climbed into his own blankets gratefully, and channeled the lamp out before releasing Saidin. This time he dreamed of Aviendha hurling fire, only she was not hurling it at a Drakkar, and Samael was sitting at her side, laughing.
Chapter 23. The fifth I give you. Raining mist around on a grassy hilltop, Egwene watched the streams of Aiel coming down from the Jangai Pass. The saddle had pushed her skirts above her knees again, but she hardly noticed that now. She could not spend every minute fussing with them, and she had on stockings. It was not as though she were bare-legged. In trotting columns the Aiel flowed by below her, arranged by clan and sept and society. Thousands upon thousands with their pack horses and mules, the Gaishain who would tend the camps while the rest fought, spreading a mile wide, and more still in the pass or already out of sight ahead. Even without families, it seemed a nation on the march. The silk path had been a road here, a full 50 paces wide and paved with broad white stones, slicing straight through hills carved to make a level. Only occasionally was it visible through the mass of Aiel, although they seemed to prefer running on the grass, but many of the paving stones had lifted up at a corner or sunk down at one end. More than 20 years had gone by since this road had carried more than local farmers' carts and a handful of wagons. It was startling to see trees again, real trees, towering oaks and leatherleaf in actual thickets, rather than an occasional wind-twisted, stunted shape, and tall grass waving in the breeze across the hills. There was real forest to the north, and clouds in the sky, thin and high, yet clouds. The air seemed blessedly cool after the waste, and moist, though brown leaves and large brown swaths through the grass told her that in reality it might be hotter and drier than usual for the time of year. Still, the countryside of Cairhien was a lush paradise compared to the other side of the Dragon Wall. A small stream meandered north beneath a nearly flat bridge, bordered by the dried clay of a broader bed. The river Galen lay not too many miles away in that direction. She wondered what the Aiel would make of that river. She had seen Aiel near a river once before. The shrunken band of water marked a definite break in the steady flow of people, as men and maidens paused to stare in amazement, before leaping across. Kader's wagons rumbled by on the road, the long mule teams working hard but still losing ground to the Aiel. It had taken 4 days to traverse the twists and turns of the pass, and Rand apparently intended to go as far into Cairhien as he could in the few hours of daylight remaining. Moiraine and Lan rode with the wagons, not ahead of them, or even with Kader's box-like little white house on wheels, but alongside the second wagon, where the canvas-covered shape of the door-frame ter'angreal made a hump above the rest of the load. Some of the load was wrapped carefully, or packed in boxes or barrels that Kader had brought into the waist full of his goods, and some was simply stuck in wherever it would fit. Odd shapes of metal and glass, a red crystal chair, 2 child-sized statues of a nude man and woman, rods of bone and ivory and strange black materials in varying lengths and thicknesses. All sorts of things, including some Egwene could hardly begin to describe. Moiraine had used every inch of space in all of the wagons. Egwene wished that she knew why the Aes Sedai was so concerned with that particular wagon. Perhaps no one else had noticed that Moiraine paid it more attention than all the others combined, but she had. Not that she was likely to find out any time soon. Her newfound equality with Moiraine was a tender thing, as she had learned when she asked that question in the heart of the pass, and was told that her imagination was too vivid, and if she had time to spy on the Aes Sedai, perhaps Moiraine should speak to the Wise Ones about intensifying her training. She had apologized profusely, of course, and the soft words seemed to have worked. Amis and the others were not taking any more of her nights than they had before. 100 or so Tardad Far Darasmai went trotting by on her side of the road, moving easily, veils hanging but ready to be donned, full quivers at hips. Some carried their curved horn bows, arrows nocked, while others had their bows cased on their backs, spears and bucklers swinging rhythmically as they ran. At their rear, a dozen Gaishain in their white robes leading pack mules struggled to keep up. One wore black, not white. Isendre labored hardest of all. Egwene could pick Adolin out, and 2 or 3 others who had been guarding Rand's tent the night of the attack. Each clutched a doll in addition to her weapons, a rough-made doll clothed in full skirts and white blouse. They looked even more stone-faced than usual, trying to pretend that they held no such thing. She was not sure what that was about. The maidens who stood that guard had come in a group to see Bear and Amis when their stint was done, and had spent a long time with them. The next morning, while camp was still breaking in the grayness before dawn, they had begun making those dolls. She had not been able to ask, of course, but she had commented on it to one, a red-haired Tomanel of the Sarai Sept named Myra, and the woman said it was to remind her that she was not a child. Her tone made it clear that she did not want to talk. One of the maidens carrying a doll was no more than 16, yet Myra was at least as old as Adolin. It made little sense, and that was frustrating. Every time Egwene thought she understood Aiel ways, something demonstrated that she did not. Despite herself, her eyes were drawn back to the mouth of the pass. The row of stakes was still there, just visible, stretching from steep mountain slope to steep mountain slope, except where Aiel had kicked some of them down. Couladin had left another message, men and women impaled across their path, standing there 7 days dead. The tall gray walls of Selene clung to the hills at the right of the pass, nothing showing above them. Moiraine said it had held only a shadow of its one-time glory, yet it had still been a considerable town, much larger than Tyen. No more remained of it, however. No survivors either, except whoever the Shaido had carried off, although here some had probably run for places they thought safe. There had been farms on these hills. Most of eastern Cairhien had been abandoned after the Aiel War, but a town needed farms for food. Now soot-streaked chimneys thrust up from blackened stone farmhouse walls. Here a few charred rafters remained above a stone barn. Their barn and farmhouse had collapsed from the heat. The hill where she sat Mist's saddle had been sheep pasture. Near the fence at the foot of the hill, flies still buzzed over the refuse of butchering. Not an animal remained in any pasture, not a chicken scratching in a barnyard. The crop fields were burned stubble. Couladin and the Shaido were Aiel, but so were Avienda and Bear and Amis and Milane and Ruark, who said she reminded him of one of his daughters. They had been disgusted at the impalements, yet even they seemed to think it little more than the tree killers deserved. Perhaps the only way to truly know the Aiel was to be born Aiel. Casting a last glance at the destroyed town, she rode slowly down to the rough stone fence and let herself out of the gate, leaning down to refasten the rawhide thong out of habit. The irony was that Moiraine had said that Celine might actually go over to Couladin. In the shifting currents of Desdemar, in balancing an Aiel invader against a man who had sent Tyrans into Cairhien for whatever reason, the decision could have tipped either way had Couladin given them a chance to choose. She rode along the broad road until she caught up with Rand in his red coat today, and joined Avienda and Amis and 30 or more wise ones she barely knew besides the other 2 dreamwalkers, all following at a short distance. Matt, with his hat and his black-hafted spear, and Jason Natail, leather-cased harp slung on his back, and crimson banner rippling in the breeze, were riding. But hurrying Aiel passed the party by on both sides, because Rand led his dapple stallion, talking with the clan chiefs. Skirts or no skirts, the wise ones would have made a good job of keeping up with the passing columns if they were not sticking to Rand like pine sap. They barely glanced at Egwene, their eyes and ears focused on him and the 6 chiefs. "And whoever comes through after Timolan," Rand was saying in a firm voice, "has to be told the same thing." Stone dogs left to watch at Tyan had returned to report the Mayagoma entering the pass a day behind. "I've come to stop Couladin despoiling this land, not to loot it." "A hard message," Bale said. "For us as well, if you mean we cannot take the 5th. Han and the rest, even Ruark, nodded. "The 5th I give you." Rand did not raise his voice, yet suddenly his words were driven nails. "But no part of that is to be food. We will live on what can be found wild or hunted or bought, if there is anyone with food to sell, until I can have the Tyrans increase what they're bringing up from Tyr. If any man takes a penny more than the 5th, or a loaf of bread without payment, if he burns so much as a hut because it belongs to a tree killer, or kills a man who is not trying to kill him, that man will I hang, whoever he is." "Dark to tell the clans this," Diarek said, almost as stony. "I came to follow he who comes with the dawn, not to coddle oath-breakers." Bale and Jiran opened their mouths as if to agree, but each saw the other and snapped his teeth shut again. "Mark what I said, Diarek," Rand said. "I came to save this land, not ruin it further. What I say stands for every clan, including the Mayagoma, and any more who follow. Every clan. You mark me well." This time no one spoke, and he swung back into Giaidine's saddle, letting the stallion walk on among the chiefs. Those Aiel faces showed no expression. Egwene drew breath. Those men were all old enough to be his father and more, leaders of their people as surely as kings for all they disclaimed it, hardened leaders in battle. It seemed only yesterday that he had been a boy in more than age, a youth who asked and hoped, rather than commanded and expected to be obeyed. He was changing faster than she could keep up with now. A good thing, if he kept these men from doing to other cities what Couladin had done to Tyan and Celian. She told herself that. She only wished he could do it without showing more arrogance every day. How soon before he expected her to obey him as Moiraine did? Or all Aes Sedai? She hoped it was only arrogance. Wanting to talk, She kicked a foot free of its stirrup and held a hand down for Avienda, but the Aiel woman shook her head. She really did not like to ride. And maybe all those wise ones striding in a pack made her reluctant, too. Some of them would not have ridden had both their legs been broken. With a sigh, Egwene climbed down, leading Mist by the reins, settling her skirts a little grumpily. The soft knee-high Aiel boots she wore looked comfortable and were, but not for walking very far on that hard, uneven pavement. "He truly is in command," she said. Avienda barely shifted her eyes from Rand's back. "I do not know him. I cannot know him. Look at the thing he carries." She meant the sword, of course. Rand did not precisely carry it. It hung at the pommel of his saddle in a plain scabbard of brown boar hide, the long hilt covered in the same leather, rising as high as his waist. He had had hilt and scabbard made by a man from Tyen on the journey through the pass. Egwene wondered why, when he could channel a sword of fire and do other things that made swords seem toys. "You did give it to him, Avienda." Her friend scowled. "He tries to make me accept the hilt, too. He used it. It is his. Used it in front of me as if to mock me with a sword in his hand." "You are not angry about the sword." She did not think Avienda was. She had not said a word about it that night in Rand's tent. "You are still upset over how he spoke to you, and I do understand. I know he is sorry. He sometimes speaks without thinking, but if you would only let him apologize—" "I do not want his apologies," Avienda muttered. "I do not want... I can bear this no more. I cannot sleep in his tent any longer." Suddenly she took Egwene's arm, and if Egwene had not known better, she would have thought her on the brink of tears. "You must speak to them for me. To Amis and Bear and Mylane. They will listen to you. You are Aes Sedai. They must let me return to their tents. They must." "Who must do what?" Cerelia said, dropping back from the others to walk alongside them. The wise one of Shenda Hold had thin white hair, and a face like leather drawn tight over her skull, and clear green eyes that could knock a horse down at 10 paces. That was the way she normally looked at anyone. When Cerelia was angry, other wise ones sat quietly, and clan chiefs made excuses to leave. Mylane and another wise one, a graying black water Nakai, started to join them too, until Cerelia turned those eyes on them. "If you were not so busy thinking of that new husband, Mylane, you would know Amis wants to talk with you. You also, Aaron." Mylane flushed bright red and scurried back to the others, but the older woman got there first. Cerelia watched them go, then put her full attention on Avienda. "Now we can have a quiet talk. So you do not want to do something. Something you were told to do, of course. And you think this child Aes Sedai can get you out of doing it." "Cerelia, Avienda got no further. "In my day, girls jumped when a wise one said jump, and continued jumping until they were told to stop. As I am still alive, it is still my day. Need I make myself clearer?" Avienda took a deep breath. "No, Cerelia," she said meekly. The old woman's eyes came to rest on Egwene. "And you? Do you think you are going to beg her off?" "No, Cerelia." Egwene felt as though she should curtsy. "Good," Cerelia said, not sounding satisfied, just as if it was what she had expected. It certainly was. "Now I can speak to you of what I really want to know. I hear the Kara Karn has given you an interest gift like no other ever heard of. Rubies and moondrops." Avienda jumped as if a mouse had run up her leg. Well, she probably would not, but it was the way Egwene would have jumped in that circumstance. The Aiel explained about Laemon's sword and the scabbard so hastily that her words tripped over one another. Cerelia shifted her shawl, muttering about girls touching swords even wrapped in blankets, and about having a sharp word with young Bear. "So he has not captured your eye. A pity. It would bind him to us. He sees too many people as his now. For a moment she eyed Avienda up and down. I will have Farron look at you. His great father is my sister's son. You have other duties to the people than learning to be a wise one. Those hips were made for babes. Avienda stumbled over an upraised paving stone and just caught herself short of falling. I will think on him when there is time, she said breathlessly. I have much to learn yet, of being a wise one. Farron is Sayadun, and the Black Eyes have vowed not to sleep beneath roof or tent until Kuladin is dead. Kuladin was Sayadun. The leathery-faced wise one nodded as though everything had been settled. You, young Aes Sedai, you know the Kara Karn well, it is said. Will he do as he has threatened? Hang even a clan chief? I think, maybe, that he will. More quickly, Egwene added, but I am sure he can be brought to see reason. She was not sure of any such thing, or even that it was reason. What he had said sounded only just, but justice would do him no good if he found the others turning against him as well as the Shido. Cerelia glanced at her in surprise, then turned to gaze on the chiefs around Rand's horse that should have knocked the lot of them flat. You mistake me. He must show that mangy pack of wolves that he is the chief wolf. A chief must be harder than other men, young Aes Sedai, and the Kara Karn harder than other chiefs. Every day a few more men and even maidens are taken by the bleakness, but they are the soft outer bark of the ironwood. What remains is the hard inner core, and he must be hard to lead them. Egwene noticed that she did not include herself or the other wise ones among those who would be led. Muttering to herself about mangy wolves, Cerelia strode ahead, and soon had all the wise ones listening as they walked. Whatever she was saying, it did not carry. Who is this Farron? Egwene asked. I've never heard you speak of him. What does he look like? Frowning at Cerelia's back, more than half hidden by the women clustered around her, Avienda spoke absently. He looks much like Ruark, only younger, taller, and more handsome, with much redder hair. For over a year he has been trying to attract Enila's interest, but I think she will teach him to sing before she gives up the song. I don't understand. Do you mean to share him with Enila? It still felt odd, speaking so casually of that. Avienda stumbled again and stared at her. Share him? I want no part of him. His face is beautiful, but he laughs like a braying mule and picks at his ears. But from the way you talked to Cerelia, I thought you liked him. Why didn't you tell her what you just told me? The other woman's low laugh sounded pained. Egwene, if she thought I was trying to balk in this, she would make the bridal wreath herself and drag both Farron and me by the neck to be wed. Have you ever seen anyone say no to Cerelia? Could you? Egwene opened her mouth to say that of course she could, and promptly closed it again. Making Nynaeve step back was one thing, and trying the same with Cerelia quite another. It would be like standing in the path of a landslide and telling her to stop. To change the subject, she said, I will speak to Amish and the others for you. Not that she really thought it would do much good now. The right time had been before it began. At least Avienda saw the impropriety of the situation finally. Perhaps, if we go to them together, I am sure they will listen. No, Egwene. I must obey the wise ones. Ji'ito requires it. Just as if she had not been asking for intercession a moment earlier. Just as if she had not all but begged the wise ones not to make her sleep in Rand's tent. But why is my duty to the people never what I wish? Why must it be what I would rather die before doing? Avienda, no one is going to make you marry or have babies. Not even Cerelia. Egwene wished she had sounded a bit less limp on that last. You do not understand, the other woman said softly, and I cannot explain it to you. She gathered her shawl around her and would not speak of it further. She was willing to discuss their lessons, or whether Couladin would turn and give battle, or how marriage had affected Mylene, who seemed to have to work at being prickly now, or anything at all, except what it was that she could not or would not explain. Chapter 24. A Message Sent. The land changed as the sun began to sink. The hills grew lower, the thickets larger. Often the toppled stone fences of what had been fields had become mounds sprouting wild hedges, or ran through long stands of oak and leatherleaf and hickory, pine and paperbark and trees Egwene did not know. The few farmhouses had no roofs, and trees 10 or 15 paces high grew in them here, little woods enclosed inside the stone walls, complete with twittering birds and black-tailed squirrels. The occasional rivulet caused as much talk among the Aiel as the small forests did, and the grass. They had heard tales of the wetlands, read of them in books bought from merchants and peddlers like Hadnan Kader, but few had actually seen them since the hunt for Laman. They adapted quickly, though. The gray-brown of the tents blended well with dead leaves under the trees and with the dying grass and weeds. The camp spread over miles, marked by thousands of small cook fires in the golden dusk. Egwene was more than happy to crawl into her tent once the Guy Shine had it up. Inside, the lamps were lit, and a small fire burned in the fire pit. Unlacing her soft boots, she tugged them off and her woolen stockings as well, and sprawled on the bright layered rugs, wriggling her toes. She wished she had a basin of water to soak her feet. She could not pretend to be as hardy as the Aiel, but she was growing soft if a few hours of walking made her feet feel twice their size. Of course, water would be no problem here, or it should not be. She remembered that shrunken stream. But surely she could even have a proper bath again. Coinda, meek and silent in her white robes, brought her supper, some of that pale flat bread made from zemai flour, and in a red-striped bowl, a thick stew that she ate mechanically, though she felt more tired than hungry. She recognized the dried peppers and beans, but did not ask what the dark meat was. Rabbit, she told herself firmly, and hoped that it was. The Aiel ate things that would put more curl in her hair than Elaine had. She was willing to bet that Rand could not even look at what he was eating. Men were always picky eaters. Once done with the stew, she stretched out near an ornately worked silver lamp that had a polished silver disc to reflect and increase its light. She had felt a little guilty once she realized that most of the Aiel had no light at night but their fires. Few had brought lamps or oil except the wise ones and the chiefs of clans and sects. But there was no point to sitting in the dim illumination of the fire pit when she could have proper light. That reminded her. The nights here would not be so drastic a contrast with the days as in the waste. The tent was already beginning to feel uncomfortably warm. She channeled briefly, flows of air to smother the fire, and dug into her saddlebags for the worn leather-bound book that she had borrowed from Avienda. It was a small, fat volume with crowded lines of small print, hard to read except in good light, but easily portable. The Flame, the Blade, and the Heart, it was called, a collection of tales about Birgitta and Guidel Kane, Ansalan and Barashel, Rogosh Eagle-Eye and Dunsinin, and a dozen more. Avienda claimed that she liked it for the adventures and battles, and maybe she did. But every last story told of the love of a man and a woman, too. Egwene was willing to admit that that was what she liked, the sometimes stormy, sometimes tender threads of undying love. To herself she would admit it anyway. It was hardly the sort of enjoyment a woman with any pretensions to sense at all could confess publicly. In truth, she did not feel like reading any more than she had felt like eating. All she really wanted to do was bathe and sleep, and she might be willing to forego bathing. But tonight she and Amis were to meet Nynaeve in Tel Iran Riod. It would not be night yet wherever Nynaeve was on her way to Gildan, and that meant remaining awake. Elaine had made the menagerie sound quite exciting at their last meeting, though Egwene hardly thought that Galad's presence was reason enough to go herring off like that. Nynaeve and Elaine had simply grown to like adventure, in her opinion. It was too bad about Swan. They needed a firm hand to settle them down. Odd that she should think of Nynaeve so. Nynaeve had always been the one with the firm hand. But since that episode in the Tower of Tel Eiran Riod, Nynaeve had become less and less someone she had to struggle against. Guiltily, she realized as she turned a page that she was looking forward to seeing Nynaeve tonight. Not because Nynaeve was a friend, but because she wanted to see if the effects had lingered. If Nynaeve tugged at her braid, she would arch a cool eyebrow at her and... Light, I hope it's held. If she lets out about that jaunt, Amis and Bear and Mylane will take turns skinning me if they don't just tell me to go. Her eyes kept trying to drift shut as she read, fuzzily half-dreaming the stories in the book. She could be as strong as any of these women, as strong and brave as Dunsinin or Narain or Melisinde or even Brigitta, as strong as Avienda. Would Nynaeve have sense enough to hold her tongue in front of Amis tonight? She had a vague thought of taking Nynaeve by the scruff of the neck and shaking her. Silly. Nynaeve was years the older. Arch an eyebrow at her. Dunsinin, Brigitta, as hardy and strong as a maiden of the spear. Her head slipped down to the pages, and she tried to cradle the small book under her cheek as her breathing slowed and deepened. She gave a start at finding herself among the great red stone columns of the Heart of the Stone in the strange light of Tel Eiran Riod, and another at realizing that she wore the Cudin Sore. Amis would not be pleased to see her in that, not amused at all. Hastily she changed it, and was surprised when her clothes flickered back and forth between the algoda blouse and bulky wool skirt, and a fine gown of brocaded blue silk, before finally settling on the Aiel garb, complete with her ivory bracelet of flames and her gold and ivory necklace. That indecision had not happened to her in some time. For a moment she thought of stepping out of the world of dreams, but she suspected she was soundly asleep, back in her tent. Very likely she would only step into a dream of her own, and she did not yet always have awareness in her dreams. Without that, she could not return to Tel Eiran Riod. She was not about to leave Amis and Nynaeve alone together. Who knew what Nynaeve would say if Amis got her temper up? When the Wise One arrived, she would simply say that she had just arrived herself. The Wise Ones had always been a bit ahead of her, or arrived at the same time before this, but surely if Amis believed she had only been there a second, it would not matter. She had almost grown accustomed to the feel of unseen eyes in this vast chamber, only the columns and the shadows and all this empty space. Still, she hoped that Amis was not too long in coming, nor Nynaeve, but they would be. Time could be as strange in Tel Eiran Riod as in any dream, but it had to be a good hour yet before the arranged meeting. Perhaps she had time to... Suddenly she realized that she could hear voices, like faint whispers among the columns. Embracing Saidar, she moved cautiously toward the sound, toward the place where Rand had left Kalandor beneath the great dome. The Wise Ones claimed that control of Tel Eiran Riod was as strong as the One Power here, but she knew her abilities with the power far better, and trusted them more. Still hidden well back among the thick redstone columns, she stopped and stared. It was not a pair of black sisters, as she had feared, and not Nynaeve either. Instead, Elaine stood near the glittering shaft of Kalandor rising out of the floorstone, deep in quiet conversation with as oddly dressed a woman as Egwene had ever seen. She wore a short white coat of peculiar cut, and wide yellow trousers gathered in folds at her ankles, above short boots with raised heels. An intricate braid of golden hair hung down her back, and she held a bow that gleamed like polished silver. The arrows in the quiver shone, too. Egwene squeezed her eyes shut. First the difficulty with her dress, and now this. Just because she had been reading about Brigitta, a silver bow told the name for certain, was no reason to imagine that she saw her. Brigitta waited, somewhere, for the Horn of Valir to call her and the other heroes to the last battle. But when Egwene opened her eyes again, Elaine and the oddly dressed woman were still there. She could not quite make out what they were saying, but she believed her eyes this time. She was on the point of going out to announce herself when a voice spoke behind her. Did you decide to come early? Alone? Egwene whirled to face Amis, her sun-darkened face too youthful for her white hair, and leathery-cheeked Bear. Both stood with their arms folded beneath their breasts. Even the way their shawls were pulled tight spoke of displeasure. I fell asleep, Egwene said. It was too much before time for her story to work. Even as she explained hastily about dozing off and why she had not gone back, minus the part about not wanting Nynaeve and Amis to talk alone, she was surprised to feel a tinge of shame that she had intended to lie, and relief that she had not. Not that the truth would necessarily save her. Amis was not as strict as Bear, not quite, but she was perfectly capable of setting her to piling up rocks the rest of the night. Many of the wise ones were great believers in useless labor for punishment. You could not tell yourself you were doing anything other than being punished while you were burying ashes with a spoon. That was provided they did not simply refuse to teach her anymore, of course. The ashes would be much preferable. She could not hold back a sigh of relief when Amis nodded and said, "It can happen. But next time return and dream your own dreams. I could have heard what Nynaeve has to say and tell her what we know. If Mylene was not with Bale and Dorinda tonight, she would be here as well. You frightened Bear. She is proud of your progress, and if anything happened to you..." Bear did not look proud. If anything, she scowled even more deeply as Amis paused. "You are lucky Coinda found you when she returned to clear away your supper, and was worried when she could not rouse you to move to your blankets. If I thought you had been here more than a few minutes alone..." The glare sharpened in dire promise for a moment, and then her voice turned grumpy. "Now I suppose we have to wait for Nynaeve to arrive just to stop you begging if we send you back. If we must, we must, but we will use the time to advantage. Concentrate your mind on..." "It isn't Nynaeve," Egwene said hastily. She did not want to know what a lesson would be like with Bear in this mood. "It is Elaine, and..." She trailed off as she turned. Elaine, in elegant green silk suitable for a ball, was pacing up and down not far from Callandor. Brigitta was nowhere to be seen. "I did not imagine her." "She is here already," Amis said, moving to where she could see too. "Another young fool," Bear muttered. "Girls today have no more brains or discipline than goats." She stalked out ahead of Egwene and Amis and planted herself across Callandor's glittering shape from Elaine, fists on hips. "You are not my pupil, Elaine of Andor, though you've wheedled enough out of us to keep you from killing yourself here if you are careful. But if you were, I would whip you from the toes up and send you back to your mother until you were grown enough to be let out of her sight, which I think might take as many more years as you have lived already. I know you have been coming into the world of dreams alone, you and Nynaeve. You are both fools to do it." Elaine gave a start when they first appeared, but as Bear's tirade washed over her, she drew herself up, that chilly tilt to her chin. Her gown became red and took on a finer sheen, and grew embroidery down the sleeves and across the high bodice, including rearing lions and white and gold lilies, her own sigil. A thin golden diadem rested in her red-gold curls, a single rearing lion set in moondrops above her brows. She did not yet have the best control over such things. Then again, maybe she wore exactly what she intended this time. "I do thank you for your concern," she said regally. "Yet it is true that I am not your pupil, Bear of the Hydo Sharad. I am grateful for your instruction, but I must go my own way on the tasks given me by the Amerlin seat." "A dead woman," Bear said coldly. "You claim obedience to a dead woman." Egwene could all but feel Bear's hackles standing erect in anger. If she did not do something, Bear might decide to teach Elaine a painful lesson. The last thing they needed was that sort of squabble. Why are you here instead of Nynaeve?" She'd been going to ask what Elaine was doing there, but that would have given Bear an opening, and maybe sounded as if she were on the wise one's side. What she wanted to ask was what Elaine had been doing talking to Brigitte. I did not imagine it. Maybe it had been someone dreaming she was Brigitte, but only those who entered Tel Riyadh knowingly remained for more than minutes, and Elaine surely would not have been speaking with one of them. Where did Brigitte and the others wait? Nynaeve is nursing a sore head. The diadem vanished, and Elaine's gown became simpler with only a few golden scrolls around the bodice. Is she ill? Egwene asked anxiously. Only with a headache and a bruise or two. Elaine giggled and winced at the same time. Oh, Egwene, you would not have believed it. All 4 of the Chavanas had come to have supper with us, to flirt with Nynaeve, really. They tried flirting with me the first few days, but Tom had a talk with them and they stopped. He did not have any right to do that. Not that I wanted them to flirt, you understand. Anyway, there they were, flirting with Nynaeve, or trying to, because she paid them no more mind than buzzing flies, when Latelle stalked up and began hitting Nynaeve with a stick, calling her all sorts of terrible names. Was she hurt? Egwene was not sure which of them she meant. If Nynaeve's temper was roused, not her. The Chavanas tried to pull her off Latelle, and Tarek will likely limp for days, not to mention Brug's swollen lip. Petra had to carry Latelle to her wagon, and I doubt she'll put her nose out for some time. Elaine shook her head. Luca did not know who to blame. One of his acrobats lamed, and his bear trainer weeping on her bed, so he blamed everybody, and I thought Nynaeve was going to box his ears as well. At least she did not channel. I thought she was going to once or twice, until she had Latelle down on the ground. Amis and Bear exchanged unreadable glances. This certainly was not how they expected Aes Sedai to behave. Egwene felt a little confused herself, but it was mainly over keeping up with all these people she had only heard of briefly before. Odd people, traveling with lions, dogs, and bears, and an illuminator. She did not believe this Petra could possibly be as strong as Elaine claimed, but then Tom was eating fire as well as juggling, and what Elaine and Julian were doing sounded as strange, even if she was using the power. If Nynaeve had come close to channeling, Elaine must have seen the glow of her embracing saidar. Whether they had a real reason to be hiding or not, they would not remain hidden long if one of them channeled and let people see it. The tower's eyes and ears would certainly hear. That sort of news traveled quickly, especially if they were not out of Amadisia yet. You tell Nynaeve from me that she had best hold her temper, or I'll have some words to say to her that she will not like. Elaine looked startled. Nynaeve had certainly not told her what had passed between them, and Egwene added, If she channels, you can be sure Elida will hear of it as soon as a pigeon can fly to Tarvalon. She could not say more. As it was, it brought another exchange of glances between Amis and Bear. What they really thought of a tower divided, and an Amerlin who, as far as they knew, had given orders for Aes Sedai to be drugged, they had never let on. They could make Moiraine look like the village gossip when they wished. In fact, I wish I had both of you alone. If we were in the tower in our old rooms, I'd say a few words to the pair of you. Elaine stiffened, as queenly and cool as she had been with Bear. You may say them to me whenever you wish. Had she understood? Alone, away from the wise ones, in the tower, Egwene could only hope. Best to change the subject and hope the wise ones were not picking over her words as carefully as she hoped that Elaine was. Will this fight with Latelle cause problems? What had Nynaeve been thinking of? Back home, she would have had any woman her age who did the same up before the women's circle so fast that her eyes would pop. You must be almost to Gildan by now. 3 more days, Luca says, if we are lucky. The menagerie does not move very fast. Perhaps you should leave them now. Perhaps, Elaine said slowly. I really would like to high-walk just once in front of... With a shake of her head, she glanced at Callandor. The neckline of her gown dipped precipitously, then rose again. I do not know, Egwene. We could not travel much faster alone than we are traveling, and we don't know where to go exactly yet." That meant Nynaeve had not remembered where the Blues were gathering, if Elida's report had been right. Not to mention that Nynaeve might burst if we had to abandon the wagon and buy saddle horses or another coach. Besides, we are both learning a great deal about the Shanchan. Sarandon served as a Sredit handler at the Court of the Nine Moons, where the Shanchan Empress sits. Yesterday she showed us things that she took when she fled Falma. Egwene, she has an idam. Egwene stepped forward, her skirts brushing Kalandor. Rand's traps were not physical, whatever Nynaeve seemed to think. "Can you be sure she was not a Suldam?" Her voice trembled with anger. "I am certain," Elaine said soothingly. "I put the idam on her myself, and it had no effect." That was a little secret that the Shanchan themselves did not know, or hid well if they did. Their Damani were women born with the spark, women who would channel eventually, even if untaught. But the Suldam, who controlled the Damani, they were the women who needed to be taught. The Shanchan thought that women who could channel were dangerous animals who had to be controlled, and yet unknowingly gave many of them honored positions. "I do not understand this interest in the Shanchan." Amis said the name awkwardly. She had never heard it until Elaine spoke it at their last meeting. "What they do is terrible, but they are gone. Randall Thor defeated them, and they fled." Egwene turned her back and stared at the huge, polished columns running off into shadow. "Gone is not to say they will never come back." She did not want them to see her face, not even Elaine. "We must know whatever we can learn in case they ever return." They had put an idam on her in Falma. They had meant to send her over the Arith Ocean to Shanchan to spend the rest of her life as a dog on a leash. Fury welled up in her every time she thought of them, and fear, too. The fear that if they did return, they would succeed in taking and holding her this time. That was what she could not allow them to see, the stark terror that she knew was in her eyes. Elaine put a hand on her arm. "We will be ready for them if they do come back," she said gently. "They will not find us in surprise and ignorance again." Egwene patted her hand, though she wanted to clutch it. Elaine understood more than Egwene wished, yet it was comforting that she did. "Let us finish what we are here for," Bear said briskly. "You need to be asleep in truth, Egwene. We had the guy Shine undress you and put you in your blankets." Surprisingly, Amis sounded as gentle as Elaine. "When you return to your body, you can sleep until morning." Egwene's cheeks colored. Given Aiel ways, it was as likely as not that some of those guys Shine had been men. She would have to speak to them about that. Delicately, of course. They would not understand, and it was not a thing she could be comfortable explaining. The fear was gone, she realized. Apparently, I'm more afraid of being embarrassed than I am of the Shanchan. It was not true, but she held to the thought. There was really little to tell Elaine. That they were in Carrion finally, that Quilladin had devastated Celian and ravaged the surrounding land, that the Shido were still days ahead and moving west. The wise ones knew more than she. They had not taken to their tents straight away. There had been skirmishes in the evening, small ones and only a few, with mounted men who quickly fled, and other men on horses who had been sighted ran without fighting. There had been no prisoners taken. Warrain and Lan seemed to think that the riders could have been bandits, or supporters of one or another of the houses trying to claim the Sun Throne. All had been equally ragged. Whoever they were, word would soon spread that there were more Aiel in Kyrian. They had to learn sooner or later, was Elaine's only comment. Egwene watched Elaine as she and the Wise Ones faded away. To her it seemed as though Elaine and the Heart of the Stone became more and more attenuated, but her golden-haired friend gave no sign as to whether she had understood the message. Chapter 25. Dreams of Galad. Instead of returning to her own body, Egwene floated in darkness. She seemed to be darkness herself, without substance. Whether her body lay up or down or sideways from her, she did not know. There was no direction here, but she knew that it was near, that she could step into it easily. All around her in the blackness, fireflies seemingly twinkled, a vast horde fading away into unimaginable distance. Those were dreams. Dreams of the Aiel and the camp. Dreams of men and women across Kyrian, across the world, all glittering there. She could pick out some among the nearer and name the dreamer now. In one way, those sparkles were just as alike as fireflies. That was what had given her so much trouble in the beginning. But in another, somehow, they now seemed as individual as faces. Ram's dreams and Moiraine's appeared muted, dimmed by the wards they had woven. Amice's and Bear's were bright and regular in their pulsing. They had taken their own advice, apparently. Had she not seen those, she would have been into her body in an instant. Those two could rove this darkness much more ably than she. She would not have known they were there until they pounced on her. If she ever learned to recognize Elaine and Nynaeve in the same way, she would be able to find them in that great constellation wherever they were in the world. But tonight she did not mean to observe anyone's dream. Carefully she formed a well-remembered image in her mind, and she was back in Tel Run Riod, inside the small, windowless room in the tower where she had lived as a novice. A narrow bed was built against one white-painted wall. A washstand and a three-legged stool stood opposite the door, and the current occupants' dresses and shifts of white wool hung with a white cloak on pegs. There could as easily have been none. The tower had not been able to fill the novices' quarters in many years. The floor was almost as pale as walls and clothes. Every day the novice who lived there would scrub the floor on hands and knees. Egwene had done so herself, and Elaine in the next room. If a queen came to train in the tower, she would start in a room like this, scrubbing the floor. The garments were arranged differently when she glanced at them again, but she ignored that. Ready to embrace Saidar in a heartbeat, she opened the door just enough to stick her head out, and drew a relieved breath when she found Elaine's head coming just as slowly out of the next doorway. Egwene hoped she did not appear as wide-eyed and uncertain. She motioned hurriedly, and Elaine scurried across in novice white that became a pale gray silk riding dress as she darted inside. Egwene hated gray dresses. That was what Imani wore. For an instant more she stayed there, scanning the railed galleries of the novices' quarters. Layer on layer they rose and fell as many levels to the novices' court below. Not that she really expected Leandrin or worse to be out there, but it never hurt to be careful. "I thought this was what you meant," Elaine said as she shut the door. "Do you have any idea how difficult it is to remember what I can say in front of whom? Sometimes I wish we could just tell the wise ones everything. Let them know we are only accepted and be done with it." "You would be done with it," Egwene said firmly. "I happen to be sleeping not 20 paces from them." Elaine shivered. "That bear. She reminds me of Lini when I'd broken something I was not supposed to touch. You wait until I introduce you to Cerelia." Elaine gave her a doubtful look, but then Egwene was not sure that she would have believed Cerelia herself until she met her. There was no way to do this easily. She shifted her shawl. "Tell me about meeting Brigitta. It was Brigitta, wasn't it?" Elaine staggered as if hit in the stomach. Her blue eyes closed for a moment, and she took a breath that must have filled her to the toes. "I cannot talk to you about that." "What do you mean you can't talk? You have a tongue. Was it Brigitta?" "I cannot, Egwene. You must believe me. I would if I could, but I cannot. Perhaps I can ask." If Elaine had been the kind of woman to wring her hands, she would have been doing it then. Her mouth opened and closed without any words coming out. Her eyes darted around the room as if seeking inspiration or aid. Taking a deep breath, she fixed an urgent blue gaze on Egwene. "Anything I say violates confidences I promised to hold. Even that. Please, Egwene, you must trust me, and you must not tell anyone what you think you saw?" Egwene forced the stern frown from her face. "I will trust you." At least she knew now for a fact that she had not been seeing things. Forget a light. "I hope that one day you will trust me enough to tell me." "I do trust you, but—" Shaking her head, Elaine sat down on the edge of the neatly made bed. "We keep secrets too often, Egwene, but sometimes there is a reason." After a moment, Egwene nodded and sat next to her. "When you can," was all she said, but her friend gave her a relieved hug. "I told myself I was not going to ask this, Egwene. Just once I was not going to have my head full of him." The gray riding dress became a shimmering green gown. Elaine could not possibly have been aware of how deeply the neckline swooped. "But is Rand well?" "He's alive and unharmed, if that is what you mean. I thought he was hard in Tyr, but today I heard him threaten to hang men if they go against his commands. Not that they are bad orders. He won't let anyone take food without paying or murder people. But still, they were the first to hail him as he who comes with the dawn. They followed him out of the waste without hesitation, and he threatened them, as hard as cold steel." "Not a threat, Egwene. He is a king, whatever you or he or anyone else says. And a king or queen must dispense justice without fear of enemies or favor for friends. Anyone who does that has to be hard. Mother can make the city walls seem soft sometimes." "He doesn't have to be so arrogant about it," Egwene said levelly. "Nynaeve said I should remind him he's only a man, but I've not figured out how yet." "He does have to remember he is only a man, but he has a right to expect to be obeyed." There was something of a haughty tone to Elaine's voice, until she glanced down at herself. Then her face went crimson, and the green gown suddenly had a lace neck under her chin. "Are you sure you are not mistaking that for arrogance?" she finished, in a strangled voice. "He's as overweening as a pig in a pea-field." Egwene shifted herself on the bed. She remembered it as hard, but the thin mattress felt softer than what she slept on in the tent. She did not want to talk about Rand. "Are you certain this fight will not cause more trouble? A feud with this Latelle could not make their traveling easier." "I do not think so. Latelle's grievance against Nynaeve was that all the unattached men were no longer hers to pick and choose from. Some women do think that way, I suppose. Aludra keeps to herself, and Sarandon wouldn't have said boo to a goose until I started teaching her to stand up for herself, and Clarine is married to Petra. But Nynaeve has made it clear that she'll box the ears of any man who even thinks he can flirt with her. And she apologized to Latelle, so I hope that may settle it." "She apologized?" The other woman nodded, her face as bemused as Egwene knew her own must be. "I thought she would thump Luca when he told her she must. He doesn't seem to think her injunction holds to him, by the way, but she did it, after grumping about for an hour. Muttering about you, actually." She hesitated, giving Egwene a sidelong look. "Did you say something to her at your last meeting? She has been different since then, and sometimes she talks to herself. Argues, really. About you, from the little I've heard." "I said nothing that did not have to be said." So it was holding, whatever it was that had happened between them. Either that or Nynaeve was storing up her anger for the next time they met. She was not going to put up with the woman's temper anymore, not now that she knew she did not have to. "You tell her from me that she is too old to be rolling around on the ground. If she gets into another, I'll have worse to say to her. You tell her that exactly. It will be worse. Let Nynaeve chew on that until next time. Either she would be mild as a lamb, or else Egwene would just have to carry through on her threat. Nynaeve might be stronger in the power when she could channel, but here Egwene was. One way or another, she was finished with Nynaeve's tantrums." "I will tell her," Elaine said. "You have changed, too. There seems to be something of Rand's attitude about you." It took Egwene a moment to realize what she meant, helped by that amused little smile. "Don't be silly." Elaine laughed aloud and gave her another hug. "Oh, Egwene, you will be Amerlin's seat one day when I am Queen of Andor." "If there is a tower, then," Egwene said soberly, and Elaine's laughter faded. "Elida cannot destroy the White Tower, Egwene. Whatever she does, the tower will remain. Perhaps she will not stay Amerlin. Once Nynaeve remembers the name of that town, I will wager that we find a tower in exile with every Ajah but the Red." "I hope so." Egwene knew she sounded sad. She wanted Aes Sedai to support Rand and oppose Elida, but that meant the White Tower broken for sure, maybe never to be made whole again. "I must get back," Elaine said. "Nynaeve insists that whichever of us does not enter..."
Alrighty, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all of y'all.